Quebec. It's Canadian, it's French, it's complicated. The modern province of Quebec is the majority French-speaking part of Canada, which is an intriguing feature in an otherwise English-speaking country. So what's the deal with this wacko corner of Canada? What makes Quebec so darn interesting to explore today? And what does all of that have to do with architecture and a big hotel? Ditch your berets and grab your winter gear as we head up north to do some history. Our story begins in 1608 when French explorer Samuel de Champlain founded a settlement in North America at a site where the St. Lawrence River narrows down on its way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes far inland. He named the settlement after a native Algonquin word for narrow passage, or simply it narrows, which in French renders as Quebec. Nowadays we call it Quebec City to distinguish it from the larger province, but back in the 1600s, Quebec was just the city, and all this was Nouvelle France, New France. This sparkly empire on the far side of the ocean took a few tries to assemble, but by the turn of the 1700s they had a nimble operation along the St. Lawrence, through the Great Lakes, and down the Mississippi River towards the Gulf and the Caribbean islands. On pure cartography, New France is deceptive. It clocks in at well over a dozen times the size of regular France, yet the settler population was merely in the tens of thousands, clustered in Quebec and nearby Montreal upriver. The rest of the sprawling territory was more of a zone of influence along a narrow highway, a vast hunting ground for lucrative beaver pelts to ship off to Europe. Comparing population, this was minuscule next to the British colonies along the Atlantic, optimized for agriculture and passing 1 million inhabitants by 1750. There is, of course, no room large enough that the French and British will not sprint across it to slap each other, and that held true on the scale of continents too. Seeing as Quebec controlled the corridor to the New World's interior, that made it a very alluring target on 4 separate occasions between 1628 and 1759. The city was tricky to take on account of its geography, with a massive great cliff walling off the riverfront side of the optimistically named Cap Diamant, or Cape Diamond. There were, in fact, no diamonds, it was quartz. Rough. But in any case, the upper city was further enclosed with stone fortifications after 1745. Yet, all of this wasn't enough to prevent the city's final capture by England in 1759. Amid the complex backdrop of the world's first multi-continental war, France lost the city and ceded the whole territory to England 4 years later as the province of Quebec. Yet, all too soon, the coastal colonies got fussy, revolted from the king, and tried to drag Quebec along with them in 1755 and again in 1812. Both failed, but they were sick of having to work for it all the time. Quebec City needed a permanent, heftier solution. In 1820, Britain began building La Citadelle, a state-of-the-art stone fortress designed to make America decide it's just not worth it. And given it has literally never seen combat, the Citadelle worked precisely as intended. But hold on, why am I pronouncing that word all French-like? Well, as a concession to the established population of New France, who were not predisposed to being fans of the British Empire, Britain adopted a broad policy of leniency across religion, culture, and language. French Canadians could carry on living their best French lives for the small, tolerable price of loyalty to the king. For Britain, it was certainly easier than fighting another revolution, and that calculated leniency is the reason Quebec to this day remains a French-majority province within Canada. Now, on the scale of wars and empires, that's undoubtedly the most transformative chapter in the history of Quebec. But history is a thing we live the consequences of as much as it is a thing that happens. So what's going on in the cultural memory of the Quebecois people? To answer that, let's jump a century ahead to the 1870s. The Citadelle has been completed, and it successfully dissuaded those raucous Americans from trying anything hinky. The problem was the old city walls were militarily obsolete in comparison, yet still there and increasingly in the way. The gates were tiny, the traffic through it was awful, and the city decided to simply get rid of them. First went the gates early on in the decade, but before the walls themselves came down, word got to the Governor General of Canada. This guy, one Lord Dufferin, or Different to the French, was horrified, because sure, capital it may be, Quebec City was the province's second fiddle after the booming city of Montreal, but the path to progress and prosperity wasn't to scrap everything and start over, rather to build on their heritage by literally building more of it. Step 1 was replacing the lost gates with beautiful new ones in a fanciful medieval-esque style, and converting the walls into a walkable public park. Mechanically, they did not serve as defenses. It's a giant open archway with literally nothing to even close. Yet the point was not to actually seal off the city, but to look beautiful and sell an idea. The 1800s was the century of romantic idealization of history, the age of literal fairy tale castles built to capture a vibe. Different gave Quebec its angle on that romanticism, beginning with gates that projected the fantasy of a castle city and growing into a beautification project which gave the city a new face and a new life. So how did all that influence the culture and the identity Quebec imagined for itself? Well, let's look at what followed from Different's spark and see what the city built across the following decades. First was his project for a splendid public boardwalk at the edge of the upper city, with gorgeous views of the St. Lawrence River. Named in the governor's honor as Terrasse du Frein, he intended to pair it with a rebuilt governor's residence of Chateau Saint-Louis since the original burned down in 1834, but his plan stalled out, so the project bounced around for a decade. Now, if the gates were a case of preserving heritage while making accommodations for modernity, these other projects created modernity while making accommodations for heritage, as new civic buildings tapped into that historic aesthetic. However, in contrast to the Anglophone provinces out west, where England's trendy neo-Gothic style was dominant, Quebec looked consciously to France for architectural inspiration. Begun in 1877, near the end of Dufferin's term, the National Parliament, or Assemblée Nationale du Québec, evoked contemporary Parisian architecture. There's a laundry list of technical vocabulary terms I promise not to assail you with. I've made that mistake and learned my lesson, but the essential feature here is the roofline, tilting in on all sides like a traditional French chateau, but scaled up to fit on a massive stone building. And that key detail, the dang roof, is the essential element that binds the entire aesthetic of Quebec. In the 1890s, the new city hall hits the medieval vibe again with the use of stone while drawing on more elements of chateau design, like protruding windows from the roofline. But more specific in its architectural referencing, and by far most fascinating of the lot, was the armory, echoing the round stone towers and delightful cone roofs characteristic of aristocratic chateaux from the Loire Valley in northern France. Certified vibe this may have been, there was an extra element at play, as these chateaux hailed from the French Renaissance of the 15 and 1600s. That's near the time Quebec was settled, so despite there never being Loire-style castles in colonial Quebec, they retroactively associated that architecture with that historical moment. It's an elegant little association. The look is a shorthand for the era, and the era is an anchor point for their cultural nostalgia. That potent mix is the stuff identity is made of. And here in Quebec, that meant a lot of chateau, up to and including the roof of this gorgeous Art Deco skyscraper from 1930. Skyscraper? Art Deco? Doesn't matter. Everything is a chateau. Now send this to your friends to totally chateau them. But in Canada, there is one chateau which towers literally and figuratively above all the rest. Possibly the most photographed hotel in the world, Le Chateau Frontenac. Built in stages from 1892 to 1924 with one more wing added in 1993, this building is a straight-up masterpiece. Do you hear me? Masterpiece. The roofline, the towers, the big central tower with tinier towers on the side of it, a perfect balance of colors between brick, stone, and copper, with proportions so objectively ludicrous it rockets past logic and skips straight to whimsy. It's wildly asymmetrical, impossibly grand, impossibly fun, but this dollhouse fantasy castle is still cohesive and readable from every angle. As a child of the 1800s, the Frontenac evokes pure romanticism, taking that historical spark from Renaissance-era chateau and extrapolating it to something fully new and entirely their own. Dear viewers, this shit rules. So how on earth did it come to be? And, ominous leading question, who was it for? Well, Lord Dufferin envisioned the site as the rebuilt governor's residence, but a new plan came from, of all places, the Canada Pacific Railway Company. Their logic wasn't just to build one hotel, but several, a literal chain of high-end hotels serving as luxury accommodations for passengers on their fancy transcontinental highway. This, in turn, was part of a much larger transit network, the critical overland link between Britain and its imperial colonies in Asia. The Frotnak, therefore, was one of many grand railway hotels built by Canada Pacific and its fellow railway lines. Iconic Canadian hotels like the Empress, Banff Springs, and Toronto's Royal York are part of this continent-spanning and explicitly imperial project. There's a very totalizing character to the Frontenac and its peers. The lobby's elevator doors are decked out with Canada's provincial coats of arms, while the ceiling decorations include French fleur-de-lis, and the Champlain dining room sports wood-carved coats of arms for figures in the region's history. There are two aesthetics at play here. On the one hand is the cohesive vastness of the British Empire, and on the other is the unmistakable trappings of aristocracy. See, despite the Frontenac's French name and French-inspired architecture, it was built and marketed as a place specifically for English speakers. Because we may be in the land of politeness and maple syrup, but do not be misled. This was the British Empire, and every piece of international iconography was crafted for an audience that looked and spoke a very particular way. To that end, the early history of the Frontenac was contentious, from its location and zoning demands, sourcing bricks from Scotland rather than locally, and a staff hierarchy where French speakers only worked the lowest jobs in the hotel. From its opening in 1893 through the 1920s, the Frontenac was a lavish bubble for the minority Anglophone elite and visitors from Britain and America, guarded jealously from the French locals like a real medieval castle keeping out the rabble. This reads like a laundry list of classic British Empire, but it's also the basic shape of most tourist industries to this day. Food for thought. So what changed? Well, populations moved around. English speakers moved to larger cities, while rural Quebecers flocked to their capital, so the hotel saw economic value in catering to a permanent and likely very loyal clientele of locals. The hotel became the place for locals to dress up and socialize, the ballroom opened to the public every weekend for dancing for 30 straight years, and locals celebrated all manner of banquets, weddings, and holidays at the Chateau. At the hotel's centenary in 1993, the general manager proclaimed "C'est votre château, Quebecois." See, provided the French population of Quebec could actually participate in the Frotnak, it symbolized everything they loved, a spectacular achievement of engineering and architecture in celebration of this mythic vision of their French history. Running with the fantasy sold by Dufferin's medieval-esque walls, the Frotnak completed the image of a city frozen in time. This appealed to Anglophones as an exotic foreign world before industrialization, as well as to French Canadians as a pure expression of historic Frenchness. These interpretations are remarkably flexible, so each camp saw exactly what they wanted in Quebec City and its towering crown jewel. And this brings us to the 1960s and the so-called Quiet Revolution, a decade of political change where Quebecois society secularized as government took on responsibilities that previously belonged to the Catholic Church. Pair that with the mythologized identity taking shape over the past century, and Quebec had the potent ingredients of its own nation, within, or potentially apart from, Canada. And I am not qualified to talk about that. I've made that mistake too, and also learned my lesson. So where does that leave us? A vision of culture created within an imperial system, eventually reclaimed by those who were once excluded. It's a vivid example of the dynamic between history and memory. The identity of Quebec was fashioned through nostalgia, yet it was truly something new, both within Canada and in the Francophone world, and truly theirs. The story of creating that identity through architecture is fascinating. And the result? Magnifique. Thank you for watching. One fun yet tangential aspect of this story is food. See, at the same time that the lower city got radically remodeled after 1970 to capture a historic French vibe, Quebec City was also opening up French-styled cafes, bakeries, and creperies. Many aspects of European French culture simply didn't click with Quebec, but others fit as logical, if anachronistic, extensions of the identity. I of course support this because everyone should have a local creperie.